Get this thing out of your tests. Watch this video to learn how. All right, let me introduce to the application first. So this is a very simple example application that calculates a user's balance. So how does one calculate a balance? You need to take income, subtract expenditure, and that is the balance. So this application does exactly that. You can pretend that this is a controller. I have it as a command line runner, but that's just for this tutorial. And it takes an argument of user ID. And we have this balance service, which has a calculate balance method. It takes a user ID parameter. It takes data from two repositories, income and purchases. And then what it does, it just iterates through incomes, adds that into an accumulator called received, iterates through purchases, adds that to a variable called spent, then calculates the balance, received subtract spent, and then it returns a balance result object, which, as you can see, is just a simple DTO that has balance, spent, received, largest income, and amount spent. Can this be done better? Of course, with streams it can, but only for the sake of this tutorial, I'm trying to keep this simple. Now, what do we have for income entity? It's very simple, just user ID, date, amount, and description. So if we run our application, you can see that it says, hello, let's check the balance of user 1, and user balance is 984.05 cents, received 1234, spent 249, and we can of course confirm that by opening a calculator and typing in 1234 minus 249.95, and that is exactly 984.05. So far, so good. Let's open the test. We have a balance service test right here. And if you've read enough tutorials, you might think that, hey, this is kind of neat. We have Mockito here, we're mocking repositories, we're mocking balance service, blah, blah, blah. When we call find by user ID with 1, we return some incomes, we return some purchases, everything is fine. We call the service and it calculates it correctly. And we can, of course, test that by doing a test run right here. And as you can see, it actually works. However, the problem here is that in order to write this test, you need to actually know how it's implemented, how the actual service is implemented. And what do I mean by that? These repositories are injected into the service. Now let's see what happens if somebody goes in and changes the code. Let's say they have a purchase repository and they created a new method such as this. Instead of find by user ID, somebody created find user purchases, which, as you can see, does exactly the same thing. It's just called differently. So if we go here and say find user purchases, and we run our application, you will see that actually the application runs and nothing has changed. We're still getting same numbers here. So one would think that, hey, this is nice and correct. However, if we try and run our balance test, that fails now. And why does it fail? It fails because method implementation has changed. However, when you really think about it, the inputs haven't changed and the outputs haven't changed. So what we did right now is we broke a very fragile test. And when you change the implementation and tests break, those are fragile tests. Now, how do we fix that? Well, the easiest way would be to change this Mockito to find user purchases, blah, blah, blah. Let's not do that. Let's make it a little bit smarter this time so that these tests don't break. If you look carefully into our balance service, you might see that this service is actually mixing two responsibilities: data gathering and actual calculations. Let's actually make this service do one thing instead of two things. So the first step to that is actually figure out where you are gathering data and where you are breaking the service boundary. So for example, it is right here. Now, what are these? These can become your method arguments. So let's move these into parameters. Let's actually, instead of a user ID, let's actually get those two as lists. So there is a list income entity. Let's call that incomes. Let's import the list and let's get list purchase entity and let's call that purchases. Now, of course, these two are going to throw errors because we are redefining them. So let's just get rid of them completely. Now, if we try to run our application, it will fail because the signature has changed. And here, instead of taking user ID, we need to pass in those lists. So let me paste the income and purchase gathering from the service into our fake controller. Let's inject income repository and let's inject purchase repository. This now works, and here we pass in incomes and we pass in purchases, and we can run our application and it should be fine. As you can see, the application runs, nothing has changed. These are the same numbers. So what we've done is we refactored data gathering outside of the service. So when it says calculate balance, that's exactly what it does. But here we can see that there's still a problem here. And if we click on that, we go and we see that our service right now also has a bad signature. So it's no longer taking a user ID. It needs to take in the lists. So let's move the lists away from Mockito mocks. And let's do incomes. Let's paste that. Let's do the same for purchases. And here we're going to pass incomes and purchases. And now we don't need those two lines. And if we run the test, you will see that the tests pass. So let's remove the redundant stuff inside the test now. We no longer need before each. We no longer need to open mocks. We no longer need the repositories. And since we are actually not injecting anything, we don't need this inject. And what we can do is we just can initialize the balance service like this. Oh, and by the way, since this service is no longer using the repositories, we can remove the constructor and injections. With that removed, the service can be initialized inside of the test without any arguments. And we can also make it final so that IDE does not complain. Also, remove the unnecessary imports and try to run the test again. And as you can see, the test runs. So we've got rid of Mockito entirely. Let's open our build Gradle and let's actually remove the Mockito dependency. We no longer need that. Tests still run. And that's how you make your service testable without actually resorting to Mockito and all that crazy shenanigans. This is very readable. You have input, action, and then assertions for output. Thank you for watching. If you have any comments, please leave them down below, and I'll see you in the next video.